Hi everybody and welcome to week 11. So we are nearly at the end of the collection management life cycle. This is where we're at this week. We're looking at collection evaluation. So this is what we've done so far. We've worked out who our users are and who our stakeholders are and what their needs are in terms of the collections that we can provide for them. Once we've understood what they want, then we can go to the selection process where we think about, okay, what is it that we need to buy to meet those needs? Then we go to the acquisition stage and we think, okay, we've got our list of stuff we want to buy to meet the needs of our users and stakeholders. How do we go about actually getting them? What are the processes we need to use to actually acquire this stuff? So then we start talking to our vendors and our publishers and saying, this is our list of things we want to buy. We either walk to the shop and get it for them in some cases, or we provide perhaps a blanket order or a standing order for particular types of items. We might hand that list over to the vendor and say, go for it, just let us know when we need to pay the bill, and let it all be done, at arm's length by another company that we're sort of trusting that process to. So it's a whole scale of really hands-on involvement through to really handing it on to somebody else and letting them do it, our vendors and publishers. So they do all that stuff, or we do that stuff, and we've got this beautiful collection. So we've worked out what our users need, we've worked out what we want to buy, we've worked out how we want to buy it, and we've involved some parties in helping us do that. So there's our collection, sitting on the shelf or sitting electronically on our servers or someone else's servers, and our collection is done. So now the process has to be, well, let's have a look at that collection and see how well it's doing its job. We need to do that through the whole processes of collection evaluation. So this is where we're at this week. This is where we're starting to look at how do we evaluate our collections to make sure that they're actually doing their job that they should do, that they're actually meeting the needs of our users and our stakeholders. Now this is actually quite a fun process because it's really, you might hate it, I suppose, if you were doing it, but I enjoy it because it's a really sort of analytical, lots of statistics, which is bizarre that I should like that really, because numbers and I don't work. But in this case, it sort of fits in my head. So let's go and have a little look at what we will be doing when we're evaluating our collections. Just hang on a sec. Okay, so to evaluate our collections, we've got a whole lot of content here under Module 8, which is where we're at for this week. So let's go and have a quick look. Okay, Chapter 8 of the textbook looks at all this stuff, so you can jump in there and have a read of that. And there's quite a bit for you to read here as well about how we evaluate our collections. So I'll leave you to look at that. There's, things to jump off into if you want to, if you're interested and want to dig a bit further. And a couple of different sort of ways of approaching this whole concept of evaluation. Do we evaluate it based on what our users are, how our users are using the collection, or do we look at the collection itself based on other measures and things like that? So have a little read of that. The thing I really wanted to walk you through though, I'm just going to keep scrolling, sorry, is this idea of collection mapping. Now collection mapping is really interesting. It's an interesting process that we can do where we look at our collections, we map them according to various criteria, and then from that we can pull up some quite nice visualizations about where our strengths and weaknesses are in our collections. So there's a bit of stuff for you to read here, but I just thought I would talk you through a couple of these charts that I've put in here because these are examples of what a collection map would look like. So what this particular library has done, and this is a university library, I think from memory. If you want to check it out, you can click in here and you'll get more information about it. So what they've done here is they've mapped their collection based on Dewey number, which is a really common way to map a collection, particularly for school and academic libraries that are using Dewey, or you could do this with Library of Congress numbers, classification numbers if you wanted to, or you could even do it with genres. You could look at how many books were in the gardening genre, for example, if you were a public library, and that might be an interesting thing to do. So what these guys have done, I'll just talk you through this table because it's quite a good little visualization of a collection. Oh, it's a high school, senior high, okay. So they've listed each of the Dewey numbers, 0s through to 900s, and then they've got extra categories based on resource format. So we've got AV, audiovisual, biographies, fiction. So there are a couple of other measures that they've decided to map against, but the majority of the work has been done against Dewey numbers. So what they've said is, let's go and have a look at what's an interesting one. This is an interesting one, 600. So they said 600s, technology and applied sciences. Okay, so that's what is in the 600s, is technology and applied science materials. They're saying that 5.8% of their whole collection falls into the 600s. And then they've mapped this against, so that's the basic collection mapping, where they've looked at what percentage of their collection falls into each of the Dewey main classes. Really interesting thing to do, to be able to identify that, you know, like for example, most of their collection, the highest number of books is in the social sciences, which sort of makes sense for a high school library. And the lowest number of books in their collection is in the languages. So maybe that school doesn't teach foreign language perhaps, or maybe they do teach it but only at a really basic level or something like that, who knows. But then the next column here is really interesting. So okay, for each of these main classes of Dewey, what is the percentage of circulation for each of these? So they're saying here that, back to the 600s, 6.6% of total circulation statistics for this library over the past year probably, was 6.6% of all circulation came into the 600s. So this is the highest use, social sciences here. 12% of all borrowing was done for books that belong in the 300s. Really interesting. So then what they can then do is then work out through this column here their goal for this part of the collection. So they're saying here, let's have a look at religion. So say they've got the 200s is religion books. They're only 0.7% of the collection are religion books, and only 0.6% of total circulation is religion books. The percentage of circulation is actually lower than the percentage of holdings. Therefore, their goal is to reduce, so they've got the minus sign there, saying to reduce that collection, because even though it's really small, it's not being borrowed at all. And so they could probably weed some of that stuff out of the collection because no one's using it, right? And there's just a couple of notes there. So that would be one interpretation, is if the circulation statistics are lower than the amount of books within that collection, then you can get rid of them because no one's using them. The other interpretation might be, well, this is actually really important because we're teaching religion in all our, grade 4, 5, 6 and 7, or this is high school, so, 11, 12, 10, 11, 12. We're teaching a lot of religion, but no one's borrowing this stuff, but it's important. So what we might need to do is actually build the collection and look at it. Why aren't they using it? Is it really tatty? Is it out of date? Is a lot of it missing? Is a lot of it not on the shelf and it's in the teacher's staff room and no one can get hold of it? What is the reason here? This is an important collection. It's not being used. Rather than weeding it, let's actually support it and build it up. That's one interpretation. So you'd have to look at these sort of statistics with the context in mind about what is happening with that sort of content. So another one here is interesting. The 800s, which is literature, so, stories. 7.3% of the collection falls into the 800s, but only 4.3% of borrowing is happening. So that might make you think, well, this is not they're not borrowing as much as there is there. So for some reason, this is underutilised. So it's either underutilised because they're not teaching literature or nobody's reading anything, which seems highly unlikely in a high school. So what they're saying here is, okay, well, let's build this collection. Let's put a plus there. So we need to actually build that collection, even though it's already quite big. It's not being used well. So let's have a look at it. Let's get in there and maybe weed out some of the really old stuff that's not being used and get in a whole bunch of new stuff for the 800s for people to then borrow. So you can see the idea here. It's a really interesting way of mapping the collection and then making some conclusions about how to evaluate the collection based on that map and what steps you might like to take after that. All right, let's look at the next one. So I've got here another couple of tables, and these came from this article here, which if you're interested in collection mapping, you can have a read of this. It's really quite useful. But let's just have a quick look at these two. So these are another way of mapping a collection. In this first one here, they've mapped the collection with two parameters. The first one being the year of publication, so the age of the items on the shelf, and then they've mapped it according to language types. So what we're learning here is that in books published between 0 and 1899, 2 of them are in Finnish, 2 of them are in Swedish, and the rest languages aren't represented, and that makes a total of 4 books. Obviously, the closer you get to now, the higher the numbers will be in general. Maybe here, what year was this published? 2010. So yeah, that number there, the 2000 to 2009 number, is lower than the 1990 to 1999 number, because they'll still be purchasing items for that later time frame there. That's why that number is lower. But what we're seeing here is that, let's say for 1990 to 1999, they have got 1,876 books in English, 1,398 books in Finnish, and on it goes. And the other thing you can do, so then you can say, okay, well, most of our books are in English, then the next lot are in Finnish, and then the lots are in Swedish. The other thing you could do with a table like this is say, okay, for our Russian resources, what years are represented by the books that are in Russian? So then you'd look along to the Russian list, you'd look down and you go, okay, we've got 1 Russian book from the 1970s, 4 from the 80s, 3 from the 90s. That comes up to 8 altogether. So that's just another nice way of mapping your collection based on age and language. And then down here, they've done a similar thing. This is the same library, but this time they've mapped it with the year of publication again, but this time they've done it with circulation statistics, so number of checkouts and the number of times that things have been borrowed, so they're currently in circulation on the 27th of March 2009. So again, you can look at things like, the highest number of loans comes from materials in the 1990s, published in the 1990s. And then books that are currently on loan. Oh, see, that's interesting. So we're looking at their overall circulation, right? They're saying that 35% of the books that have been circulated in their collection have come from the 1990s, 35. But down here, if you look at this measure here, this is things that are currently on loan on the 27th of March 2009, and it's much higher for the 2000s, because obviously people are borrowing stuff now that has been published more recently. Really interesting. So anyway, I've talked enough about collection mapping. I think it's just a really interesting way of evaluating your collection. So I really wanted you to understand what these tables mean and what sort of information we can learn from them. I will leave it with you to read on, and next week we are looking at weeding. So you get to the point where you've evaluated your collection and you've worked out the stuff that you want to keep, the stuff that you want to buy more of, and the stuff that you're going to start thinking about getting rid of or putting into storage. And that's what next week's all about, is those processes of weeding stuff out of our collection to either move it on to somewhere else or to pop it into storage. So we'll see you next week, where we'll talk some more about that. Thank you. See ya.